Welcome to Alchemy. My name is Dennis William Hauck, and together we will explore the ancient mysteries of alchemy.
In November 1913, Carl Jung commenced an extraordinary exploration of the psyche, or soul. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. During this period, Jung willfully entered imaginative or visionary states of consciousness. The visions continued intensely from the end of 1913 until about 1917, and then abated around 1923. Jung carefully recorded his imaginative journey in 6 black-covered personal journals, referred to as the Black Books. These notebooks provide a dated chronological ledger of his visions and dialogues with his soul. Beginning in late 1914, Jung began transcribing from the Black Book journals the draft manuscript of his Red Book, the folio-sized leather-bound illuminated volume he created to contain the formal record of his journey. Jung repeatedly stated that the visions and imaginative experiences recorded in the Red Book contained the nucleus of all his later works. When Jung's biographical memoir, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, was published in 1962, the Septem Sermonis, Ad Mortuis, was included as an appendix. However, the Red Book includes, after each of the sermons, an additional amplifying homily by Philemon, or Jung's spirit guide. Jung kept the Red Book private during his lifetime, allowing only a few of his family and associates to read from it. The only part of his visionary material that Jung chose to release in limited circulation was the Septem Sermonis, which he had previously printed in 1916. Throughout his life, Jung occasionally gave copies of this small book to friends and students, but it was available only as a gift from Jung himself and never offered for public sale or distribution. The abyss, the empty fullness. In Gnostic language, the dead refers to the non-Gnostic, all of us who are spiritually dead and who identify with the hylic, or material and vital worlds, to the exclusion of the psychic, or religious, and pneumatic, or spiritual natures. Basilides begins by describing the Gnostic pleroma, which is both emptiness and fullness, differentiated and undifferentiated, containing all the opposites in a state of equilibrium. In fact, the pleroma has no qualities, and these are created by our thinking. Not thinking, but just being, is true differentiation, and therefore the need is to strive after one's true nature, not discrimination and differentiation as they are known by the mind. The natural tendency of the incarnated soul is to differentiate itself from the pleroma and to learn discrimination and discernment. Differentiation is the essence of the created world, including man. Thus, the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation, meaning differentiation of the being, is a fundamental motive force in Jung's system of psychology. The danger confronting the human being is the seductive pull back into the abyss of the pleroma, in that it is nothingness and dissolution, while giving up the light of consciousness and the urge towards individuation. Helios, image of God and the devil. God, says Philemon in the second sermon, is the created world inasmuch as he is differentiated from the pleroma. He is, as such, a quality of the pleroma. We are then presented with the differentiation of the two great polar opposites, Helios, that is to say, God the Son, the summum bonum, or supreme good, representing fullness, generosity, and Eros, or relatedness, and the devil, the infinite malum, endless evil, representing emptiness, destruction, dissolution, thanatos, or death. In the created world, these two stand as active opposites, each with discernible effects on our world. There is yet another God, differentiated from the pleroma, yet its closest approximation. He is difficult to know because man does not perceive his power, and he seems less effective than either Helios or the devil. His name is Abraxas, and he represents the power of reconciliation of all existent forces and activity, transcending both God Helios and the god the devil. Abraxas, the heavenly chanticleer. Abraxas is the supreme power of being, in whom light and darkness are each united and transcended. It contains all the opposites of creation in a state of unconscious complementarity. Life is generated and regenerated by the power of Abraxas, which is impersonal, amoral, non-discriminating, and merciless. It is both the instinctual depths of the erect phallus of Priapos and the archetypal heights of the spirit. Abraxas is the closest approximation to the active manifestation of the pleroma, being force, duration, and change. As universal, undifferentiated psychic energy, Abraxas generates both truth and falsehood, good and evil. It is the life of creation, and both deceitful reality and powerful in the world of unreality. Above all, counsels Philemon, this God is terrible, demanding fear and admiration. Jung's unknown God. Jung's unknown God, Abraxas, appeals to three principles of Jungian psychology. First, the concept of libido. Second, the union of opposites that require differentiation through the individuation process. And third, the natural urge towards individuation that demands gradually assimilating aspects of the unconscious, Abraxas, into consciousness. At the beginning of a more consciously inclined life, traditional moral law and a dogmatic spiritual discipline are helpful to accomplish a specific goal, namely the strengthening of the power of the will against Abraxas, the naturalistic psyche. Once that specific goal is met, normal dogmatic morality must be transcended to allow for a higher ethic. In the process of individuation, the psyche is often forced into situations where there is a real conflict of duty and an ethical dilemma. When faced with such conflicts of duty, the individual must appeal to the transcendent function, a higher principle, which contains a wider view than either of the two opposites in conflict. Not to do so means falling into one or the other side of the conflicting opposites, which in Jungian terms is the cause of neuroses. To be influenced by the transcendent function, on the other hand, opens one to a deeper, more contemplative life, and the assimilation of aspects of the unconscious, the terrible Abraxas, into one's own consciousness and life. The burning bush and the tree of life. The further we go along here, the more we are impressed with the depth and complexity of Jung's thought, as he attempts to give voice to his experience of the mystery of existence. In the fourth sermon, we are again confronted with the paradoxical and mysterious nature of the psyche. There is, in addition to Helios, that is to say, God and the Sun, as the highest good, and its opposite, the devil, a great many goods and evils, a multiplicity of gods and devils, including two god-devils, the burning one, or Eros, and the growing one, or tree of life, and Logos. As god-devils, Eros and Logos are not only opposites, but they each contain within themselves oppositional powers. It is the mutual coexistence and interpenetration of these two great powers of being that the secret of wholeness must be discovered. The growing one represents the spirit of civilization, the logos of the zeitgeist. It continually creates institutions, regulations, codes, laws, and forms in order for life to build and expand on stable and secure ground. In Western Christianity, there is a tradition, dogma, and doctrine that can aid one's religious growth, but also stultify and limit and encourage conformity. In addition to essential cultural expressions and the development of civilization and the regularity of cyclic patterns, there is the shadow of sclerotic conservationism and triviality, repression, and conservative behavior. The burning one, or Eros, sexuality, on the other hand, seeks life in creativity, change, the lure of adventure, challenge, and battle, and according to the witness of history, conflict and violence. It rebels against the restrictions of civilization. Eros also represents the impetus towards knowledge of and relationship with others. The burning one thus represents individual creative spirit and the impetus for individual truth, but also the shadowy wildness below the surface and the veneer of civilization and culture, both the joy and the suffering of life. The two communities, Mother City and Father Fortress. Although today many people are quick to criticize Jung and his interpretation of women and the feminine principle, the fifth sermon points to a paradoxical dark mystery behind the intuitive concepts he refers to as Eros and Logos. Reversing most contemporary understanding, yet following ancient myth, Jung understands the feminine to be Mater Celestis, the heavenly mother, who comes as a dove, and the masculine to be Phalos, manifesting as a servant, the earthly father. Thus the dove is ostensibly feminine and represents the spiritual power that receives, and most importantly, comprehends, while the serpent ostensibly represents the giving and generating male principle of procreation, which must receive in order to give. Thus, in addition to Logos, the masculine principle possesses all the characteristics of Eros and the feminine principle, in addition to Eros, containing all the characteristics of Logos. Logos, or meaning, governs the spiritual in men and the sexual and instinctual connectedness in women, while Eros, or relatedness, governs the spiritual in women and the sexual and instinctual in men. Each gender is blessed with one Logos and one Eros principle, but in an opposite manner. This is the basis for the mutual attraction and unconscious projections between men and women. The conscious male consequently identifies with the mind, law, and order, and is directly connected to the feminine Mater Celestis, the goddess Logos. Since his spirituality, according to the sermon, moves in the direction of the greater and is heavenly, there is a tendency in man's thinking, therefore, towards abstraction, spirit, and the realm of ideas. The principle of phallus and the god Eros, meanwhile, tends to act upon the masculine nature from the unconscious, a reflection of the fact that a man's sexuality and instinctuality, says the sermon, moves in the direction of the smaller and is earthly. Being in touch with his sexuality and instinctual nature, therefore, keeps a man related and connected to earthly reality. In contrast to the male psyche, where the goddess Logos rules his conscious life, the great carrier of meaning for the feminine psyche is the god Eros. This allows women to be more conscious in relationship and relatedness. Her sexuality and instinctive relatedness accordingly moves in the direction of the greater and is heavenly. Thus a woman is more likely to find meaning in sexuality and instinctual relatedness than a man, where these dynamics of life lay in the unconscious and are blind. For women, where Eros rules her conscious life, the goddess Logos, on the other hand, acts from the unconscious. This allows the feminine psyche to function in the world, but without her perceiving meaning as a man does. Despite the fact that women's Logos functions unconsciously, she often does the right thing through woman's intuition. Moreover, in contrast to men, a woman's spirituality moves in the direction of the smaller and is earthly. This means that a woman's thinking tends to be practical and down to earth, even when it turns to philosophy and psychology or yoga or any other discipline requiring mental competence and application. It becomes evident from this discussion that the dynamics of the psychic energy lying in the male psyche differ from those which lay in the female psyche. The requirements of individuation, which aim at wholeness, are therefore typically quite different for men and women, although the principle of individuation is identical. The goal of individuation is androgyny, and not a monotonous unisex, although in either case there is a need to come to terms with both spirituality and sexuality. Spirituality and sexuality and the instinctual nature are manifestations of the gods and exist objectively in their own right. Thus, the individuating psyche must learn to detach itself from these demons, yet not repress them, as the psyche is subject to their laws. Men and women must become conscious of both the god Eros and the goddess Logos that lay in their respective unconscious, or else remain victimized by them. In psychological terms, there is a need, in other words, for men to become conscious of, first, their personal shadow, and then their anima, the feminine mediatrix, and bridge to the deeper unconscious in men. There is likewise a need for women to become conscious of their personal shadow and the animus, the masculine beacon and bridge to the collective unconscious in women. In the measure that this is not done, one is possessed by unconscious complexes. Solitude. Humankind requires both community as well as solitude, each ideally in harmony with both Logos and Eros. Community gives warmth and depth, while solitude gives light and height. From a psychological perspective, community serves the purpose of generating human warmth and depth through relationships and work in the community, while solitude engenders the light of consciousness and spiritual elevation. Jung reverses the normal view of life as he states that community requires abstinence, while solitude, through such activities as active imagination and direct engagement of the multiple psyche, requires the squandering of abundance. In addition to the proper attitude towards both solitude and community, the consciously individuating psyche needs to find a judicious balance between the two. Too much or too little of either is evil, which is to say psychologically unhealthy, while the just balance purifies. Jung's insight expressed here on the nature of intrapsychic dynamics and both the interplay between men and women and community and solitude are invaluable to the contemporary seeker for a community in a new world. Always cognitive of the opposites of levels of being, according to the meaning Jung attributes to the serpent, it is outwardly masculine and phallic, but inwardly feminine, and enkindles or is receptive to desire. In a similar way, the dove, which is outwardly feminine, is inwardly masculine and represents conscious thought and messages from the spirit and transcendence. The spirit and the dove, therefore, each make up half the human psyche, of which one must become conscious for the sake of gnosis. Although it is normally accepted that messages of transcendence and the spirit can be helpful to leading a meaningful spiritual life, it is not so well understood that acceptance of one's instinctual force and desire nature is also sine qua non for coming into touch with one's wholeness. Following the way of the serpent does not mean to do so blindly or unconsciously and without discipline, which would only lead to further unconsciousness. In the language of Indian psychology, it would involve becoming further enmeshed in the kleshas of existence. But it does not mean that there is a need to consciously follow the instinctual forces of desire, even to allow oneself to be led by them. This inevitably involves conflict and the need to experience and hold in consciousness a tension of opposites, even at times apparent chaos, in order to gain consciousness of eros or relatedness. Like Goethe's Mephistopheles, the serpent shows us the way in a manner one would never choose by one's own wit. In Gnosticism, The serpent is both wild beast and holy counselor, the symbol of supernal reason. Not repression, but loving regard for one's nature, consciousness of one's desires and creative imagination connects one to the path of knowledge. Abstinence in the material world, indulgence in the spiritual realm. There is a need not to mistake change, which is a movement of nature per se, with transformation, which requires the opus contra naturam, the transformational work against nature of the alchemist. In the alchemical view, individuals are the unique link between the microcosm, which includes their personal experiences and the world inside themselves, and the macrocosm, the world of transcendental being, and the world outside themselves. One is confronted here with two aspects of the mystery of existence that meet in the human psyche, and consequently relate directly to what Jung refers to as synchronicity, or the meaningful coincidence of outer and inner events. Jung understands synchronicity to involve observable conscious experiences of general acausal orderliness, which implies that the manifestation involves the unfolding of a superior divine will, the divine Shakti as a manifestation of the Purusa in Indian philosophy. At times one can experience this reality through conscious archetypal experience and synchronicity, as light penetrates the darkness of the shadow existence. According to Basilides, individuals have the task of following their own inner star, which is their God and pleroma, and the goal of individuation. The implication of the statement is that God, or the God image, is an existential reality that can be experienced in one's psyche. Indeed, individuals need to attend to increasing the light of the star, or God image, which is to say become more conscious of the God image in their own soul through tapas, or the application of will. As Jung argues in answer to Job and elsewhere, not only does man need God, but God needs man in order to fulfill his purpose and to effect his own transformation. Engaging the power of imagination through dynamic meditation, approaches such as Jung's method of active imagination can allow one to become more aware of the indwelling Godhead and its realization in life. Humans can be turned away from their own God and conscious engagement in the individuation process by the fiery spectacle of Abraxas, which is to say by the naturalistic psyche of worldliness, gross materialism, sensuality, and even false optimism and idealism, among other things. The great danger to spiritually inclined people, however, is that they can too easily sacrifice Abraxas, or life itself, to the star, which is to say spiritual ambition. Humankind is placed between life and spiritual reality, and one should not identify with either. The principle of individuation always insists on the continual refinement of individual consciousness, and not dissolution of being in the pleroma, or non-differentiation of being swallowed up in Abraxas. Life in the material world, in Jung's way of thinking, is indispensable to spirit, for spiritual truths are irrelevant, he believes, if they cannot be incarnated in life. Consciousness is not enough. Individuation means conscious life. In the star, the path is unexpected, and in the material world, you must practice abstinence. In the spiritual realm, you must engage in complete indulgence. This is the end of the Gnostic work. Jung now turns to alchemy for deeper insights in his further research.